get started with the introduction. As I said, welcome everyone. This webinar is about greening for cooling, and we will talk about how trees or any green space is very helpful in mitigating heat island effect. Or not, I don't know. Our presenter will decide on that. Our presenter, Dr. Alessandro Ossola, is an associate professor at UC Davis and an honorary research fellow at the University of Melbourne. He has done a lot of work in Australia and in US and around the globe on urban heat and cooling and ecology, covering topics like water management, sustainable planning, design. Recently, he's also working with forest fire in California, which is a very big issue right now. Ossola also advised governmental agencies at multiple levels on urban land management and environmental policy. Other presenter, Jared Sinners, is a first-year PhD student in geography, graduate group at UC Davis, but he has a lot of background in landscape architecture and plants. For the last 15 years, he has worked on projects related to greenhouse crop, urban runoff, and pest control outreach, and primarily focusing on managing University of California landscape plant irrigation trials. Jerry is interested in how plants fit into larger conversation around water use and human well-being in urban environment. With that, I would like to welcome both of you.
Thank you, Sheetal. Thank you, everyone, for having us here virtually. Sorry we can't be around you in person today, but hopefully it's going to be an interesting ride. We're going to give you an overview of where our lab is heading in terms of research, and we added a couple of considerations related to the implication for policy and decision-making across California of our work. Because as you know, California, we have the land of sun and the land of policies, and most likely some of the policies that are going to be devised here in California are going to spin off in other states comprising yours in the dry and hot West. Today, Jared and I talking to you from the land of the Patwin people, our local tribe, aka UC Davis, in the middle of Central Valley, again, hot and very sunny. We have 280 days of sun condition every year. Our lab is essentially a pretty large lab where we are looking at different foci of research and practice related to urban plants in general. You can see here our main foci, mostly around issues related to climate change and urban forestry. Overall, our group it's pretty large. We have 5 postdocs and a lot of different students. We use a lot of different approaches to trying to understand how we measure plants in digital environments. We're using a lot of big data approaches. I'm going to show you in a bit. We are using experiments in the glasshouse, in the field trials, and also in the real landscape. So we are trying to collect different streams of data to make sense of how plants are plastic, how they might function in a landscape, and what are the drawbacks, the pros and cons that we need to consider if we want to optimize landscaping in California and United States overall. We've been lucky enough to get funded for now, we'll see, from a number of different sources. Lisa was one of our first postdocs, and she worked essentially in a NIFA USDA funded project where we were interested to understand how trees of the same species are growing in 3 different cities, as you see here, where the main driver of growth that we want to explore is actually water availability, precipitation. As you see here, we are studying Sacramento, New Orleans, and Raleigh. They have similar temperature regimes. What really changes is precipitation. In Sacramento, we have a summer drop in precipitation, and Elizabeth has been painstakingly going across the country to essentially measure as many trees as possible. These are the objectives and the underlying hypothesis, but these are some of the species that we focused on. As you can see here, these trees were planted commonly across all the species. There are different traits. They're both native and introduced. They have different types of wood anatomy and leaf type. And our idea essentially has been the idea of going into these cities. We selected trees of different age cohorts, so mature youngs and treelings, so newly planted trees. And Elisabeth has been trying to track down these trees in cool, mesic, and hot environments across these urban heat islands in these three cities. And what we did essentially was locate these trees in cities, and then measure a lot of different ecophysiological parameters. You see here a thermal shot of Sacramento, and you see here different trees. And essentially, we've been trying to track down these trees and measure also how they grow, because our hypothesis is that essentially the urban heat island effect is moderating growth overall. And we were lucky enough that a couple of years ago, we successfully co-wrote a postdoc fellowship for Maureen, who was visiting from Germany, and she's a soil hydrologist. And essentially, Maureen piggybacked onto that design, and Maureen is also integrating data related to imperviousness of urban landscapes. This is again a screenshot of impervious areas in Sacramento. In our hypothesis, trying to understand to what extent the local tree pit environment is actually moderating effects that are related to the microclimate itself, or at larger scale, the regional landscape aridity and atmospheric aridity. So with Maureen, we're trying to phenotype essentially different growing environments, trying to characterize soil properties around the tree. Here you see tree magnolia with planted in a park in a low impervious area versus similar tree planted downtown Sacramento in a tree pit that has a completely different hydrology. What Maureen is doing is actually testing a kind of controversial hypothesis whereby she thinks that in dry, arid cities, pavement could actually be used strategically to conserve water if we allow water to infiltrate during our rain seasons. Essentially, pavement could actually act as a sort of storage tool to be able to prevent evaporative loss from soil to the atmosphere. So this is what we've been testing lately. To measure trees as well, we've been drilling them to see how they grow and how they grew back in time. So we're using dendrochronology approach. And this is a collection of magnolias that we have drilled, and you see, all the different rings. And now we are trying to extract different wood cores and trying to partition growth in different years, and integrating isotopic analysis to try to see whether the wood itself composition is somehow related to past periods of urban drought that are related to microclimate changes, El Niño, La Niña cycles, but also localized changes in terms of drought and in terms of heat waves. We've been having a lot of fun to drill trees in different ways. This is a resistograph, so we're actually using different approaches. And now we have a lot of data that we're dealing with, so stay tuned. A bunch of papers coming out here. Unfortunately, we couldn't come to Utah, but maybe that's something we can do in the future, and drill some trees in Salt Lake and other cities around it. Definitely interesting climate with different type of seasonal changes. I spent significant amount of time in Australia, 10 years, and like Australian cities, many cities in America, they are relatively biodiverse in terms of number of trees that we have. For example, in Sacramento, we have about 150 tree species in the public realm. Very different from Sydney, for example, in Australia, where we have 560 species planted, so a huge diversity. The issue that we had back in time was trying to understand how we possibly scale up our measures from a limited number of species and cultivars that we can realistically test in the glasshouse or in trials up to entire floras. So in a project called Which Plant Where, we got lucky that we leveraged about $10 million of funding from Oat Innovation Australia, which is an umbrella organization of overgrowers in Australia. And we essentially advanced several different types of ways to trying to test plants and their resilience to climate change, if I'm allowed to say this word. In Australia, our emphasis was mostly related to drought and heat waves. Oftentimes, these two different extremes are coupled, at least in our cities, in dry and hot climates. So, in a way, we need to test how plants can somehow have plastic responses, not to a single stressor, but couple stressors as well. This is an example of a method that we kind of reinvented. It was much older, and then we kind of perfected for the 21st century, I guess, where we are artificially droughting plants using this system. You see this foam, floral foam. I know many of you might not be aficionados to this material, but it's actually pretty handy because it's allowing us to grow plants in a pot with this water table that little by little gets lowered every day. And we are essentially creating this artificial drought that can last, for a significant amount of time, even months, if we can keep the plants alive. So rather than stopping irrigation of plants, we are actually trying to simulate in a glasshouse, in a greenhouse environment, more realistic drought of potted plants. In our case, we're also imposing, of course, an artificial heat waves and see how plants are, getting stressed out. So these type of methods are allowing us to test, in this case, about 115 species and 7,000 pots, which is not a huge experiment, but not a small one. So now the challenge that Jared, myself, and all my colleagues and students here have in California is that in California, as you know, we are a floral kingdom by itself. Currently, there are about 8,000 plants available in the market, both native and exotic. Of course, we can't measure all of them. It's going to take many careers to be able to even start thinking about that. But what we are trying to do is essentially strategically pick plants on cultivars that are either commercially important and or potentially new selections that we select with growers to try to understand to what extent these plants might make sense or not in our future climate in California. We integrate horticultural and ecological approaches because single reason. For example, when we test how people are thinking in horticulture about drought tolerance, you see here there is this terminology drought intolerant, tolerant, but then every line here is a species or is a cultivar. But if we look from the ecological literature, you see that for many, many of the species, there is actually a mismatch of how people are intending drought tolerance. So unless we measure some sort of hardcore ecophysiology behind this, to be able to screen as many plants and cultivars as possible using traits that are relatively stable, and Jared is going to talk a bit more about this, then it's really, really hard to predict across climate zones, even between Utah and California, whether a plant is going to fare well under a particular extreme event. So going back to this particular work that we did in Australia, in our case, we were lucky enough to be able to have a lot of space, a lot of technical capabilities to simulate drought over time and well water condition, and imposing on top of that drought also artificial heat waves. Only 1 week of heat wave, peaking at 41, 42 Celsius, not extreme heat wave. For many Australian plants, they like it hot and dry, so they're actually not even stressed. But what we will manage to find is that once you couple, if you look at the bottom right graph here, once you couple, drought and heat wave events on a set of plants that are both exotic and native to Australia, the thermal safety margins of plants are pretty much zeroed. So it means that we can try to estimate drought tolerances and all of that, but then we need to remember the plants in the landscape, they're going to be subjected to 10,000 other stresses. And in our case, if we want to make sure that plants that are in the trade right now are going to be faring well in the future, we have to look at the problem more holistically. So I'm going to pass it to Jared for now.
All right, good afternoon. Let's do the remote control. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two projects that I'm working on that I started as a researcher on campus, and then I've continued on as I pursued a master's degree. The first project is about polyploidy. And so polyploidy is where you have a standard number of chromosomes and then you modify them through various methods to add an additional chromosome. So in some cases, you'll use a product like colchicine. And this is typically done to produce plants that are infertile. And so this is a really popular method for creating plants that you can plant in a landscape that won't then escape out and spread their seeds. For example, in the Northeast, there are polyploid Berberis cultivars that we're starting to see introduced in the trade because Berberis produce fruit and the fruit moves around and it's become an invasive species. But these polyploids are an avenue to keep Berberis in the landscape in that region, these newer cultivars. And so we decided, well, polyploidy, it can affect the seed, or essentially the ability to reproduce, but it can also have a myriad of other effects. So for example, in Hawaii, there's a plant called a royal ponciana tree, and they developed a polyploid version that had a thicker epidermis, and that allowed it to survive an insect that was kind of attacking the royal ponciana. And so that kind of sparked discussion in our group. What if there's a knock-on effect in terms of polyploidy affecting drought tolerance? And so this is something we don't know if it works. We're in the process of this experiment because if it does, let's see, sorry, there's supposed to be some animation happening and things are supposed to, there we go. Okay, so the fun bit of this, the thing that we get really excited about is if we can use polyploidy to create more drought tolerant versions of plants that people know, that could be really beneficial to the nursery industry, because instead of having to go out into the world and find new plants, you can develop plants that people already know and like. And so that was the impetus behind the grant. We had this entire species list that we were excited to trial. We were working with an ornamental plant breeder, Dr. Ryan Contreras at Oregon State. And our original plan was to develop a field trial and then a greenhouse trial using the methodology that Alessandro worked on in Australia. However, we had some issues. The one thing that you encounter, especially when you're working with cultivars that aren't released on the market that are being developed, is sometimes you may have a situation where a bunch of your cuttings don't strike, or they don't essentially move to the point where they can be planted regularly. And this is not advancing to the next slide. So, oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag. So what do you do when things aren't working out? You have to pivot. And so we were really fortunate. Alessandro discovered this paper by Heinrich Schoemann. And he essentially evaluated the turgor loss point of roughly 130 different shrubs that are native or commonly used in his region of the world, which is Northern Europe, Scandinavia. And two of the shrubs that he evaluated were ones that we were evaluating, Spirea japonica, Little Princess, and Spirea japonica. And one thing that we noticed when we looked at the Spirea japonica, the actual species was much more drought tolerant than all of the cultivars that were derived from it. And so this is one thing that we've decided, instead of focusing kind of just on the field trial, is we've incorporated this turgor loss point measurement into our species. And so this is a really interesting methodology. Basically, turgor loss point is the point at which the cells kind of collapse. And so what we do is we collect leaf samples and we run them through this machine, this W4PC. Beforehand, you collect your sample and you dip it in liquid nitrogen, and then you put this in the machine, and the machine is going to tell you when that cell collapses and what the pressure is. And depending on what that turgor loss point is, you can create a index of where the plants fit. And so we're actually now, we got some funding and we're developing this turgor loss point for a variety of different hibiscus. We've selected hibiscus because this is one, it's not a tree, but this is one where we see a lot of use of polyploidy by a variety of different breeders to induce different characteristics. And we're seeing that actually, as you, at least with our preliminary data, we're kind of seeing the inverse of what we had hoped. So as you create more polyploid cultivars, they're getting lower turgor loss points and becoming potentially less drought tolerant. We have a really small sample size of only 4 replicates. We recently got some supplemental funding to expand this, and we're going to try this on about 30 different hibiscus cultivars, and we're excited to see kind of where we end up with this. We're currently planning on doing this at the end of summer, early fall, when we have our undergraduates back and we can kind of start running a bunch of samples in the lab. And so the other project I'm going to talk to you about is the climate ready vines for the United States. So at UC Davis, we have this long running plant trial called the UC Landscape Plant Irrigation Trial, where we evaluate landscape plants at different levels of deficit irrigation. And we try and develop irrigation recommendations for consumers, both homeowners and landscape professionals. And we decided to modify this protocol and focus on vines because they're a really underutilized nursery crop relative to sort of shrubs, grasses, perennials, and annuals. And the other impetus for this was, how do we shade cities? As the climate warms up and we do see more people moving into cities, how do we make those cities livable? Trees are a great way to do that. They are kind of the gold standard of creating shade. However, there are some limitations in urban areas. So for example, you may have a situation where you have a really impacted root zone. There's lots of concrete, the tree pit is very small, and so you can't really plant a tree, or you have kind of above ground large amounts of structures that will really inhibit your tree growth. The other, I guess, caveat of trees in terms of generating shade is time. Trees take kind of at least a decade roughly to create an appreciable canopy that's going to shade a large area, whereas vines can grow really quickly. And if you have kind of a large structure that you can train them on, they can create shade in several years. And so we created this project working with Chital at Utah State. We're working with Ursula Schuch in Arizona and Sue Kim at the University of Washington, and then Natalie Levy in Irvine as a part of the UC Cooperative Extension to evaluate vines across the Western US. And we have several common taxa, so this Campsis Madam Galen, Lonicera goldflame, Parthenocissus quinquefolia, Passiflora, and then Rogers Red, California grape. And we're evaluating those across all sites, and those are essentially our standards to see how they perform in different climates. That's really helpful for us because this will allow us to essentially evaluate how these species, these individual species and cultivars are going to perform potentially in the future. So for example, in Davis, we are projected by the end of the century to have a climate roughly like Phoenix. And so we can use the data that we generate from our site in Arizona to provide some guidance in what to plant. This has been a really great project because it's allowed us to see how the different vines grow. There are certain plants, like we in Davis, we planted 10 species. We killed 3 off. And then we replanted and we killed them again because we're really thorough researchers. But it's been a really great process to see how these vines grow. We've started our open house season. We're having our first open house, at least at UC Davis tomorrow, where we get members of the horticultural world to come in and provide feedback, and also kind of outreach and show how the different vines are growing, to see if that is a plant that maybe someone wants to grow or specify in a landscape. And kind of part of the reasons why we do these trials is because in terms of landscape irrigation recommendations, they're very sparse on the ground, especially scientific recommendations. In food crop production, there is a large amount of information on how to irrigate those crops, just because they're widely grown and it's very narrow in the amount of crops that are produced relatively to a landscape. For example, our WUCLS, the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species, provides irrigation recommendations for landscape plants in California. It has 3,500 taxa in it. And so this is one opportunity through our research that we can provide scientifically derived irrigation recommendations so people can more thoroughly irrigate their plants without over irrigating them. And this allows us to save water, but also to create really livable cities where plants are going to thrive.
Now, possibly some of you will observe this type of behaviors of plants. When plants are stressed out, then they can create a lot of issues. This is actually an example of my own place in Davis, the first place I rented here. We had 3 root intrusions 3 times, and my landlord had to send me 3 times to an hotel. And this is interesting because it's actually a really common issue that is related to urban plants and trees. And is one of the couple of things that we're going to discuss next about issues that we might have when plants are going wild in urban landscapes. One is tree intrusion, and the other one we're going to discuss is fire. Bringing you back to Australia, just to give you an idea of the cost, in Sydney, which is a town of 5 million people, every year Sydney Water essentially spends about $20 million to remove tree roots from daily pipes, whether it's sewer pipes or whether it's potable water pipes. And this is interesting because particularly when it's dry and hot, trees are more stimulated in trying to find weak joints and trying to get into the pipes. So, there is water and there is nutrients, so everybody is happy. This is an example where we worked a lot with, stakeholders, particularly Sydney Water. And pretty much we went to Sydney Water and saying, well, you're wasting literally $20 million a year to remove roots from pipes. Just give us 1 million and we're going to try to figure out a solution here. So in this case, we use a lot of data. A few years ago, so it's first type of AI models that were coming out. But just to give you an idea, if you haven't been to Australia, Sydney, it's a pretty large town. There is a coastal area where city center is, which is actually the most biodiverse area. Whereas in the west, about 60-mile inland, it gets really, really hot. It's about 10 degrees Celsius hotter, particularly in summertime, and there is no water. So historically, the number of intrusions of trees in pipes actually spiked during drought periods particularly in the dry and hot west of town, where actually the city is expanding. You see here that some areas are really, really diverse, and then this close-up map here, you see the differences between the positioning of the pipes, the trees, and also the occlusions. So trying to predict occlusions and the probability of that one species might intrude a pipe is actually really, really hard because, as I said before, in Sydney we have between 500 and 600 species of trees planted. And then the built environment is really complicated because pipes have been laid down, 200 years ago or maybe 50 years ago. There are many different materials, there are many different depths, and so on. So what we did here is essentially, was trying to get all the data we could get our hands off, tree inventory data, pipe data, environmental data, and so on. So we threw all the data to this platform, one of the first AI platform for research. And our idea was, at least initially, to try to understand which tree species, or genera at least, were most problematic. So our variable that we wanted to test was whether the number of root occlusions per unit of length of pipe were somehow related to all these different variables here. You see that are color-coded, so in blue are pipe-related variable, in maroon environment-related variable, and in green tree-related variable. Of course, the top variable explaining about half of the variability in our data set was the number of tree stems per unit of pipe. That's kind of self-explanatory, right? You don't have trees, you don't have root occlusions. So that's not my paper in Nature anytime soon. But we can also see a couple of trends here. Most of the tree-related variables were actually less important, but the presence of Ficus microcarpa, which is really invasive, and we know that from plant ecology. But the issue is that if there is a pipe that leaks and the environment is conducive for trees to grow roots there, then any species of trees will get in. So don't blame the trees if there is a tree root occlusion. Most likely the issue is an infrastructure issue, is not a biological issue. If we were selecting the only trees, we also try to rank species, even though, as I said before, they are not super important. But then we have emerging properties. And as you see here, that there are some genera like Ficus microcarpa, obliqua, benjamina, and so on, that are somehow recurrent. For example, Ficus obliqua is ranked as the 5th most common species in our AI model around pipe occlusions. But then when you see the relative abundance of this species along all the pipes in Sydney is really, really uncommon. So it's 363rd, third here. So it means when there is a Ficus obliqua next to a pipe, then there is a high chance that that guy is going to get in and occlude the pipe. So the pipes are just one aspect of drought tolerance that has tangible effects and drawbacks for our stakeholders in general. And it's something that, I don't know, there might be an issue in Utah and Salt Lake and so on, but something to think about, particularly as the planet warms up and we are lacking water. The other question that I want to ask you is, well, do you like the redwoods? Do you like sequoias? Hopefully some of you, or most of you, have been to California. And this is a segue for me to switch to our other foci or focus of what we are doing here, which is using global models of species distributions. So we're trying to understand where species are currently present in their natural niche to see where they fit into an urban areas globally. So in this case, in this example here, you see the global frequency of coast redwood, our Sequoia sempervirens, in relation to one of the bioclimatic variables that we use commonly here, which is mean daily maximum air temperature of the warmest month. This species is commonly planted here in the Central Valley, but guess what? Sacramento is already kind of their baseline in this maroon color. In the future, our temperature is going to go up by the end of the century even more. So this species, despite being extremely common, is actually going to get really, really toast. And yet, if you just go down the road, and I'm not making names here, so you can just read the label, you can still buy this species in the market. Now, I don't want to go into the details of the ethics of this or anything related to growers' perceptions of markets and all of that. But as a scientist, I can tell you that we are planting 100% failure here. It's not just this shop, it's many other shops. So it's an issue that we really need to correct fast, because we can't afford to plant a plant that is going to pop and burst, in flames in 20 years from now, or that we can only artificially keep alive because we are wasting so much of our precious water, particularly in California and as well Utah, Colorado, and so on. Now, you want to see the real sequoias? Where do you go in California? Clearly, you go to Costco again, same issue. You buy plants that fail for $54.99, and I believe this is not acceptable. That's my opinion, and I've been pretty vocal about this thing because I think we can do much, much better as horticulturalists and as aficionados of our plants. This type of modeling approaches is something that we use commonly in our research. This is just an example of similar study led by Pooja, one of our postdocs, and Dr. Schiffer, which is our supercomputer here in the lab. In this case, we are essentially modeling the current and future distributions of about 500 species of trees that are already planted in America, in community gardens across America and in cities, but they have at least one organ that is actually edible to humans. So all the species, they might have either the sap, the bark, the fruit, the nuts, the leaves, or whatever that somehow is edible to us. So funded by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and we're working with the American Community Gardening Association here, we are actually trying to understand what's going to happen to our community gardens in the future. These are all about 3,700 community gardens in different states. Some states have a lot of them, like here in California. Some other states, like Mississippi, there are only 14 community gardens. What we know from our climate models is that 3 out of 4 of these urban agroecosystems will likely fall in a different climate zone by the end of the century. Here we're using copper climate zones. We also know that most of these community gardens are going to definitely increase temperature during the growing season by 5 to 7 degrees Celsius potentially, which is a lot. And only a minority of these community gardens are going to see an increase in likely water availability and precipitation during the growing season. So that's an issue because it means that potentially we are going to have a shortfall in water available for plants, or we need to use and waste more water for irrigation. So this is an example of how all this apparatus of data looks like. So we are, for example, here modeling Coriol's cornuta, which is big hazelnut. You can make a sort of fake Nutella or native Nutella out of this. It's not very productive as a crop, but still, relatively common in some areas in the United States. So what we do is we collect all these global occurrences from a variety of different sources, and then we intersect this with all the different climate data set and climatologies that we use. We use CHELSA, which is a global climatology at 1 kilometer resolution globally with future projections. And we are creating models of the current distribution of this crop like here, and also the future distribution of this particular crop. And you see here that, for example, Corylus cornuta is going, towards Canada, so is potentially migrating poleward and also gaining altitude, elevation. So we are essentially moving crops around. What we are doing here is to create all these maps probabilistically for as many species as we can, and we can technically model any other plant, not necessarily trees and not necessarily only edible species. And what we are doing essentially is trying to add and merge nutrition and plant science. And we are essentially scraping data from a different variety of sources, and we want to provide this data with final stakeholders and urban farmers in America so they can try to plant climate-ready trees that can provide nutritional values to communities, particularly communities that don't have access to fresh produce and food. So by the end of summer next year, we are going to launch a sort of tool that's similar to what we did in Australia, where you're going to enter your zip code here. In this case is Sydney zip code 2000. And automatically this tool is going to tell you that by the end of the century, 2070, we're going to have 615 species, in this case, of plants that are climatically suitable for that particular geographic location. Of course, then you can, select by, different traits and, make the most of our science so final stakeholders and growers can have the confidence that somehow this species are going to make sense for that location. Lastly, I want to touch briefly on issues that are very close to me and close to some of people in our lab and the Forest Service that help support us a lot in the last few years. We started really, really small, trying to understand risks and how trees are burning and coming back after fire. We focused on a small fire, relatively small fire, the Tubbs fire that burned in 2017 in Santa Rosa, California, killing 22 people. So we've been traveling up and down our state to try to see and to do forensics of how fire looks like in urban landscapes and what are the impacts for people. It's really hard to do this job. It's really gut-wrenching to talk to residents who lost everything but that scrappy stem with a couple of leaves on that somehow are still providing some sort of emotional connection to people, for people to place, even though the place that has been rebuilt is completely different compared to the original thing. So we've been traveling around burn areas to trying to find trees and how they survive and where they survive. Most of the trees left, for example, in Santa Rosa, are at the perimeter of the fire where I guess Cal Fire defended and resident defended the fire. As you know, unfortunately, on January 7th, we had our largest state disaster with 5 to 7 fires that broke down, and actually the Eaton and the Palisades fire being the largest, so Altadena and the Pacific Palisades. So since January, literally, we dropped everything we were doing, and we've been analyzing data to try to understand what went wrong and how complex is this type of situation, particularly considering that Cal Fire is still applying old-fashioned fire ecology rules of engagement to landscapes like urban areas where you have a million different factors to consider when you're trying to predict fire behavior, flammabilities, and how to recover from fire. You can imagine a backyard is full of many different chemicals, it's full of gas bottles. In the front yard, you have a Tesla with batteries that can burst in flames and burn for a week. The other interesting or scary thing about this fire is that it actually happened in our peak rainy season in January during winter time when 70% of trees were still evergreen, but 30% of them didn't have a canopy on. In Vietnam fire, which is Altadena, north of Pasadena, for those of you who are not familiar, we have about 200 species of trees planted in the public right of way. There's data from the Palisades fire, similar number of species, 250. So what we've been doing here with our extension services and many colleagues and volunteers and the state and people, local communities and UCLA colleagues and so on, I have too many to thank. We actually spend a lot of time doing forensics on the trees that burn down, the type of damage. For example, to the crown here, you see different types of consumption to the crown. Same issue with stems. You see eucalyptus here on the right-hand side, exotic to California, really invasive, but hey, he really likes it. Fire scorch. So what we are doing now is essentially trying to make sense of all the data we collected. We have a lot of papers coming out from this situation because it's a unique learning opportunity. After having spent weeks working every day collecting data, you see here the type of damage that vegetation is getting. You have situations where the damage is always directional. You have radiative heat delaying phenologies of deciduous species or having preferential burns based on distance from buildings. On the other side, if you have cars parked in the road, the damage is actually coming from the other side. It's coming from the street side of that particular tree. So doing forensics on this has been really emotional, really tiring. We've been ferrying around LiDAR sensors and trying to collect and document as much as we could before the Army Corps of Engineers is coming and bulldozing all our proofs. The good news is that our native species is one of our California oaks. They like fire, they're actually coming back. And we've been working with a lot of arborists, most of them out of state, to train them first, because most of them didn't even know our species, and trying to give them tips of how to look for sign of life in this destruction. I conclude by saying that, in my opinion, fire issue in urban landscapes is not an issue of trees, is an issue of lack of maintenance and proper care of trees. And this is where, in the last few weeks, I've been spending a lot of time talking to policymakers and decision makers. There is currently a draft of a new policy on Zone Zero that actually came out this morning from Cal Fire and our Bureau of Fire, where we are possibly regulating and removing every single piece of vegetation, mulch, anything that can burn within 5 feet for every building, at least in fire zones across California. It means that if we don't get it right, we're going to have millions of trees and plants removed from the landscape. Undoing what Jared's been predicating about the vines being great. Potentially, we're not going to have a pergola left in California. It remains to be seen whether our California future somehow looks like a potential Utah future. But Jared and I and my group would like to keep up the conversation, and hopefully we gave you some inspiration of the challenges that we are facing and where we are going. Please get in touch if you have any questions. We're always here to listen and to learn from you as well. Thank you, Shital, for having us.
Awesome. Thanks, Alessandro and Jared, for this wonderful presentation. A lot of details, a lot of data, lots of findings. But I think I did see one question in the chat, which I am going to ask to Jared. It's for Jared. Jared, when you get a chance, please explain how trees with polyploidy did in comparison with other trees. I think this is for drought.
Yeah, so we're still conducting that study right now, but at least with our TLP results, we're seeing a situation where the polyploid cultivars had they had less negative TLP than the non-polyploid. And so this is not what we had hoped for, or I guess what we expected, because we were hoping that the polyploid cultivars would be a little bit more drought tolerant and have more negative TLP values, because everything is essentially less than zero. So the greater negative number that you have, the more drought tolerant it's supposed to be. However, we only tested 4 cultivars. So this is something that kind of based on that initial use of the TLP protocol, we're going to expand this and see, is this something where it's just unique to our 4 cultivars that we chose, or if, as we expand it to 30 cultivars, is this going to be a trend that we're going to see? Because one other aspect that we see with, I guess, trying to identify drought tolerant plants and low water use plants is the impact of breeding and selection. So as we're selecting plants, are we essentially kind of selecting out resilience?
Okay. Thanks, Jared. David Wright asks, we know that trees are fundamental to cultural landscape, provide shade and cooling, and control pollutants. They are amazing. They also consume water. What is the best literature describing how to balance their value between their benefits and water use?
That's a very good question, David. Thank you for asking. It's tricky, particularly when you're dealing with hundreds of species with so many different disparate traits and or a lot of different cultivars, as Jared was describing. Plant breeding for ornamentals are always focused historically, since we started maybe 2000 years ago, on aesthetics. We never bred plants for climate change related traits. We didn't know climate change existed until 50, 70 years ago, right? So my point is that we need to change the narrative of how we are doing our work. And collecting data, to me, is critical. One aspect that we are dealing with in California is new pieces of policies that are currently in the book that actually growers try to tamp it down, where we'll need to stop irrigation on non-functional turf across our state by in the next few years. At least initially only in commercial areas in new development. This is a well-intended policy to save water, right? Everybody wants to save water in the dry and hot West. The issue that the legislator doesn't necessarily know is that if we stop irrigating lawns, we are actually stopping irrigating our trees, and we might have unintended effects of millions of trees dying, not because, anything but us stopping irrigation. So when we are thinking about policies, we always need to think about what are the maladaptive effect of policies. And doing that, considering hundreds of thousands of species and millions of trees, I get it, is not easy. That's why we're here to do science and research now.
I don't see anything else. I think that is all. This was a wonderful presentation, Alexandra and Jared. Thank you so much for your thoughts and sharing your research and everything. I think it's very helpful just as a homeowner and even as a policymaker on how we think about fires, drought, trees, when we all know that trees can cool the surroundings.